I'm Marcus Reeves, 64 years old, and this is the story of how my survival expert son-in-law learned that calling a retired Army Ranger and SERE instructor a soft veteran is the kind of mistake that gets you stranded in the wilderness you claim to master, begging for rescue after 6 hours when you'd promised to survive 30 days. Especially when that SERE instructor spent 26 years teaching soldiers how to survive, evade, resist, and escape in the harshest environments on Earth. Training that goes far beyond anything YouTube survival content could ever replicate. 10 weeks after we buried my daughter Rachel, my son-in-law Kyle Patterson posted a video on his YouTube channel showing him supposedly surviving alone in the wilderness for 30 days. The video was edited into a dramatic series showing Kyle building shelters, making fire, hunting food, and overcoming various survival challenges. His narration emphasized how his elite survival training and years of wilderness experience allowed him to thrive in conditions that would break most people. The series got 40 million views across all episodes and established Kyle as one of the premier survival experts on social media. Kyle's content consistently emphasized that modern survival expertise had evolved beyond traditional military survival training. He'd say that while military survival courses taught basic skills, true wilderness mastery required the advanced techniques and mindset that he'd developed through years of solo expeditions and extreme environment challenges. He positioned himself as representing the cutting edge of survival knowledge that made military SERE training look like beginner-level preparation by comparison. The videos resonated with millions of followers who saw Kyle as the ultimate authority on wilderness survival. His subscriber count had grown to 3.5 million across platforms, all watching his survival content and many purchasing his ultimate survival course for $2,497. The course promised to teach the advanced survival techniques Kyle used during his solo wilderness expeditions, techniques he claimed went far beyond anything taught in military survival schools. I watched Kyle's 30-day survival series from my home in Montana, the same home where I'd spent the past 15 years after retiring from the Army. I watched with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 26 years as an Army Ranger and SERE instructor, someone who'd survived in jungles, deserts, Arctic conditions, and every other harsh environment the military operated in. Someone who'd taught thousands of soldiers the actual skills needed to survive when everything went wrong. And what I saw in Kyle's videos was mostly fabricated drama with minimal real survival capability. Before I tell you how Kyle learned that Army SERE instructors don't just teach survival from books, but actually live it in conditions that break untrained people, I need you to do something. If this story resonates with you, if you've been dismissed as outdated by someone who confused social media content with real expertise, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next will show you why military survival training creates capabilities that social media experts can't fake when faced with actual wilderness conditions. And leave a comment telling me about a time someone with shallow knowledge dismissed your deep experience. Your stories matter, and I read every single one. Kyle Patterson had married my daughter Rachel 7 years ago when he was 26 and she was 28. He'd presented himself as an outdoor enthusiast and adventure guide working at a wilderness camp, passionate about nature and survival skills. Rachel had been an emergency room nurse, grounded and practical, but she'd been attracted to Kyle's adventurous spirit and his knowledge of the outdoors. Their marriage had seemed solid for the first few years, living in a cabin outside Bozeman while both pursued their careers. Then 4 years ago, Kyle had discovered survival content creation and everything changed. He'd started filming his outdoor activities and posting survival tutorials on YouTube. His early content had been basic: how to build a fire, how to purify water, basic shelter construction. But as he learned what generated views and engagement, his content became increasingly dramatic and extreme. He started filming multi-day solo survival challenges, claiming to be alone in the wilderness for extended periods using only basic gear. Kyle's breakthrough came with a series called 30 Days Alone, where he claimed to survive in remote wilderness for a full month with only a knife, a pot, and basic clothing. The series was edited into 12 episodes showing his supposed journey through the 30 days, each episode highlighting different survival challenges and techniques. The production quality was excellent, the drama was compelling, and the series went viral. Kyle's subscriber count exploded from 50,000 to over 2 million in 6 months. The monetization followed the viral success. Kyle launched the Ultimate Survival course, teaching his supposed advanced techniques for extended wilderness survival. He sold premium memberships to exclusive content. He secured sponsorships from outdoor gear companies. He was invited to speak at survival expos and outdoor shows. His income from survival content creation exceeded $30,000 monthly. He'd transformed from a wilderness camp guide into a full-time survival content creator and self-proclaimed expert. The lifestyle followed the income. Kyle and Rachel upgraded to a larger property with land for filming content. Kyle bought expensive camera equipment, professional-grade outdoor gear, and a truck equipped for wilderness access. He attended survival expos as a featured speaker, networking with other outdoor content creators and gear manufacturers. He'd completely immersed himself in survival influencer culture and had built an identity around being an elite wilderness expert. Rachel had been supportive initially, but had grown increasingly concerned over the past 2 years before she died. She'd mentioned to me that Kyle's survival videos weren't as authentic as they appeared. She'd noticed that his multi-day solo expeditions often had signs of crew support, tire tracks near his camps, food wrappers that appeared in shots, equipment that shouldn't have been there if he was truly alone with minimal gear. She'd also noticed Kyle's actual outdoor skills seemed limited compared to the expertise he projected in his edited videos. Rachel had shared specific concerns 6 months before she died in that accident. A hiking fall, tragic and sudden. She'd said Kyle had gotten lost on a simple day hike they'd taken together and had panicked until they found a trail marker. She'd said his fire-building skills were inconsistent. Sometimes he could do it, sometimes he struggled for hours. She'd questioned whether his 30-day survival series was actually filmed over 30 days or was staged with support. She'd been planning to ask him directly about the authenticity of his content. Then the accident happened, and she was gone before she could confront him. After Rachel's death, Kyle had become increasingly dismissive toward me and my military background. He'd make comments about how modern military survival training was basic compared to the advanced techniques real wilderness experts used. He'd suggest that military SERE training was just classroom instruction and controlled exercises, not real survival in truly remote conditions. He'd imply that my 26 years as a Ranger and SERE instructor had taught me outdated methods that wouldn't work in actual extreme survival situations. The provocations escalated over months. Kyle would visit for necessary family gatherings and tell stories about his survival expeditions, always emphasizing how much more challenging and authentic they were compared to military training. He'd describe situations he'd supposedly overcome and suggest they were beyond anything military survival training prepared people for. He'd talk about the difference between controlled military exercises and real wilderness survival, where you were truly alone with no support. Then Kyle posted a video that made my decision to confront him inevitable. The video was titled Military Survival Training versus Real Wilderness Survival and showed Kyle discussing the limitations of military SERE programs. He said that military survival training was designed for short-term evasion scenarios with the expectation of rescue, not for true long-term wilderness survival. He said military training taught cookie-cutter techniques that worked in controlled conditions but failed in real wilderness challenges. He specifically said that modern military veterans, particularly older ones from past decades, had been taught soft survival skills that wouldn't work in actual extreme conditions. The video got 18 million views and thousands of comments from Kyle's followers agreeing that military survival training was basic compared to real wilderness expertise. Several comments specifically mocked military SERE training as being easy compared to actual solo survival expeditions. Kyle responded to these comments enthusiastically, positioning himself as representing true wilderness mastery versus the limited military approach. I watched that video from my Montana home, sitting in the room where I'd kept records and photos from 26 years of teaching soldiers how to survive in conditions that most people couldn't imagine. Kyle thought I was a soft veteran whose military survival training had been basic classroom instruction. What he didn't understand was that Army Ranger and SERE training wasn't theory. It was intensive practical experience in the harshest environments, teaching skills that could keep soldiers alive when captured behind enemy lines or stranded in hostile territory with no support and no rescue coming. Here's what Kyle didn't know about my background and actual capabilities. Kyle didn't know that Army Rangers weren't just regular infantry. Ranger training included extensive survival instruction in multiple environments: woodland, desert, mountain, jungle. We'd been trained to survive on minimal resources, to move through hostile territory undetected, to evade pursuit, and to escape if captured. The training was designed to create soldiers who could operate independently in any environment for extended periods. Kyle didn't know that SERE instructors weren't just people who'd read survival manuals. SERE instructors were selected from personnel who'd demonstrated exceptional survival and evasion skills under the most demanding conditions. We underwent intensive training that included practical survival exercises in extreme environments, resistance training that simulated captivity conditions, and escape training under realistic pursuit scenarios. The selection process was rigorous because SERE instructors would be teaching skills that could save lives in actual combat and evasion situations. Kyle didn't know that during my 26 years as a SERE instructor, I taught thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines how to survive in every conceivable environment and situation. I'd conducted survival training in Arctic conditions where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. I taught jungle survival where the environment was actively hostile with disease, predators, and vegetation that could kill you. I'd run desert survival courses where dehydration could kill you in hours. I'd supervised resistance training that pushed students to their psychological and physical limits. Kyle didn't know that SERE training wasn't just camping with minimal gear. It included surviving with nothing: no knife, no pot, no shelter materials. It included evasion exercises where students had to avoid pursuit by trained trackers over many miles of wilderness. It included resistance training where students experienced simulated captivity conditions to prepare them for potential POW situations. The training was intense, demanding, and absolutely practical because it prepared personnel for real worst-case scenarios in combat zones. Kyle didn't know that at 64 years old, I still maintained the survival skills I'd taught for decades. I still practiced shelter building, fire making, water procurement, and food gathering. I still went on solo wilderness trips for weeks at a time, intentionally limiting my gear to maintain skills. I still trained in different seasons and conditions to ensure my capabilities remained sharp. The skills I'd learned and taught didn't atrophy because survival fundamentals never changed regardless of whatever new gear or techniques emerged. Most importantly, Kyle didn't know that I'd been analyzing his survival content with the trained eye of someone who'd seen thousands of survival situations and could recognize the difference between real capability and staged entertainment. The signs of fake survival were obvious to someone with my experience. His shelter construction showed techniques that looked good on camera, but wouldn't actually provide adequate protection in harsh conditions. His fire-making demonstrations were performed with processed materials that made it easy, not with natural tinder in wet conditions like actual survival required. His food procurement never showed the extended periods of hunger that real wilderness survival involved. I'd also noticed that Kyle's physical condition and behavior in videos didn't match someone actually surviving on minimal resources for extended periods. After supposedly 30 days in the wilderness with limited food, Kyle looked healthy and well-fed rather than showing the weight loss and fatigue that actual extended survival caused. His clothing and gear showed minimal wear despite supposedly constant use. His demeanor was energetic and confident rather than showing the psychological stress that real prolonged survival produced. Everything suggested his survival content was staged with significant support rather than actual solo survival. The final provocation came when Kyle announced he was hosting a major survival challenge event. He called it the Ultimate Wilderness Gauntlet and positioned it as a competition where survival experts could test their skills against his. The event would take place in the Montana wilderness not far from where I lived, with participants attempting various survival challenges while Kyle demonstrated superior techniques. He promoted it as an opportunity to prove who had real wilderness mastery versus who just talked about survival. Kyle posted promotional content specifically mocking military survival training. He said the event would show the difference between real wilderness survival and soft military training that assumed rescue was always coming. He said he'd challenge any military veterans to participate and show whether their SERE training could match his wilderness expertise. He invited skeptics to attend and discover whether military survival methods worked in real conditions. It was clearly directed at me, challenging me to prove my military training was adequate. I contacted Kyle directly and said I'd participate in his survival challenge event. But I suggested we make it more interesting than a few hours of demonstrations at an organized event. I proposed a real 72-hour survival challenge. Kyle and me dropped together in remote Montana wilderness in early spring when conditions were still harsh, with only the basic gear Kyle claimed was sufficient for his 30-day expeditions. No camera crew, no support team, no pre-stage supplies. Just the two of us proving who actually had wilderness survival mastery. Kyle was trapped by his own ego and his public image. He'd spent years claiming to be an elite survival expert who'd survived alone for 30 days. He'd just publicly challenged military veterans to prove their training. If he refused a direct challenge from a 64-year-old retired SERE instructor, his followers would question his credibility. He accepted my challenge, posting about it on social media and positioning it as an opportunity to demonstrate that his wilderness expertise exceeded military survival training. What Kyle didn't understand was that this wasn't going to be a controlled event where he could stage favorable conditions and edit footage to look impressive. This was going to be real wilderness survival in early spring Montana, where temperatures could drop below freezing at night, where finding food required actual hunting and gathering skills, where building shelter meant the difference between surviving and suffering hypothermia. And it was going to expose that Kyle's survival expertise was mostly camera angles and editing, while his actual capabilities were minimal. The soft veteran was about to teach the survival expert what real wilderness survival looked like. And Kyle was going to learn that military SERE training created capabilities that social media content couldn't fake. The morning after Kyle accepted my 72-hour survival challenge, I began preparing for what would be a comprehensive demonstration of the difference between real wilderness survival capability and social media performance. The challenge was scheduled for 3 weeks later in early April, when Montana wilderness conditions would still be demanding: nighttime temperatures near freezing, unpredictable weather, limited natural food sources, and terrain that required genuine navigation and survival skills rather than staged content production. I spent those 3 weeks preparing methodically using the same approach I'd used for 26 years when designing SERE training exercises. The goal wasn't just to survive the 72 hours. I'd done that countless times in far harsher conditions during my military career. The goal was to create a scenario that would definitively expose the gap between Kyle's claimed expertise and his actual capabilities, while demonstrating that military SERE training created practical survival skills that worked in real conditions without camera crews or editing. I started by analyzing Kyle's survival content more systematically, watching every video he'd posted over 4 years with the trained eye of someone who'd evaluated thousands of students in survival situations. I made detailed notes about the techniques he demonstrated, the environments he claimed to master, and most importantly, the subtle indicators that his content was staged rather than authentic. What I found confirmed that Kyle's survival knowledge was superficial and his actual wilderness experience was minimal. His shelter construction videos showed structures that looked impressive but had fundamental flaws that any SERE instructor would immediately recognize. The shelters were positioned in locations that were scenic for filming but poor for actual survival, exposed to wind, near water that would create humidity and cold, in areas where drainage would fail during rain. The construction techniques emphasized aesthetic appearance over functional insulation and weather protection. Several shelters showed materials that wouldn't have been naturally available in the claimed locations, suggesting they'd been brought in by support crews. His fire-making demonstrations were similarly problematic. Kyle would show himself successfully creating fire using various methods: bow drill, flint, and steel, fire plow. But the demonstrations were always performed in ideal conditions with dry processed materials. Real survival fire-making required working with damp natural tinder, in wind and rain, often when you were cold and fatigued. I taught fire-making to thousands of students in actual survival conditions and knew that Kyle's demonstrations showed technique without understanding the environmental challenges that made fire creation difficult. His food procurement content was perhaps the most revealing. Kyle would show himself hunting, fishing, and gathering wild edibles, always successfully obtaining food. But real wilderness survival involved extended periods without adequate food, the psychological stress of hunger, and the physical weakness that came from caloric deficit. Kyle's videos never showed this reality. He always looked well-fed, energetic, and healthy. His supposed 30-day survival series should have shown significant weight loss and fatigue by the end. Instead, he looked essentially the same throughout, suggesting he'd been supplementing his diet with food from support crews. I also analyzed the timeline claims in Kyle's multi-day survival videos. He'd claimed to be alone for 15 days or 30 days, documenting his survival journey. But several indicators suggested the actual filming took place over much shorter periods with significant breaks. His beard growth was inconsistent between supposed consecutive days. His clothing showed patterns of washing that wouldn't be possible in actual wilderness conditions. The weather and vegetation in backgrounds sometimes showed seasonal changes that shouldn't occur within the claimed timelines. Everything pointed to Kyle's extended survival content being filmed in short segments over longer real-world periods with support between filming sessions. Most significantly, I noticed that Kyle's survival videos never showed him dealing with the serious challenges that defined real wilderness survival, the moments of genuine crisis when skills truly mattered. He never showed himself seriously lost and having to navigate out using only natural indicators. He never showed himself dealing with actual injury or illness in the wilderness. He never showed the psychological breakdown that could occur during extended isolation and deprivation. His content was all successful outcomes and confident narration, never the struggle and doubt that characterized real survival situations. While analyzing Kyle's questionable expertise, I maintained my own skills through practical training. I spent several weekends in the Montana wilderness deliberately practicing survival in early spring conditions similar to what Kyle and I would face during the challenge. I built shelters using only natural materials, made fire in damp conditions, procured water from snow and natural sources, and tested my navigation skills without GPS or maps. At 64, I wanted to ensure my capabilities remained sharp enough to both survive comfortably and to assist if Kyle got into serious trouble. I also prepared the specific logistics for the 72-hour challenge. I coordinated with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to ensure we had proper permits for wilderness access. I arranged for a bush pilot to drop us at a remote location approximately 15 miles from the nearest road or trail. I established a satellite emergency beacon protocol where we could call for rescue if life-threatening situations developed. I wanted the challenge to be demanding and authentic while having safety measures for genuine emergencies. The gear allowance for the challenge was based on what Kyle had claimed was sufficient for his 30-day survival expeditions. Each of us would have a knife, a metal pot, a tarp, 50 feet of paracord, basic clothing appropriate for the season, and waterproof matches with enough for 3 fires. No food, no sleeping bag, no tent, no GPS, no communication devices except the emergency satellite beacon. Kyle had repeatedly said in his content that this gear list was more than adequate for extended wilderness survival. Now he'd have to prove it. I also arranged for documentation of the challenge through a neutral third party. A wilderness cinematographer who'd filmed survival content for various military and outdoor programs would hike in separately and position remote cameras at several locations to capture footage without interfering or providing support. The footage would be time-stamped and unedited, providing objective documentation of what actually happened during the 72 hours. Kyle had initially resisted having any cameras, probably preferring no documentation of potential failure, but his social media followers demanded proof of his participation. 2 weeks before the challenge, Kyle posted content preparing his followers for the event. He talked about how he'd demonstrate the superiority of modern wilderness survival techniques over outdated military methods. He said the challenge would prove that his years of solo expeditions had taught him skills that military SERE training couldn't match. He positioned the event as an opportunity to validate his expertise against a skeptical military veteran who didn't understand that survival knowledge had evolved beyond what the Army taught. Kyle's confidence in his content was absolute. He clearly believed his own narrative about being an elite survival expert. He'd filmed enough staged survival content and received enough social media praise that he'd convinced himself his skills were genuine. He didn't seem to understand that real wilderness survival without editing and support would expose the gap between his social media image and his actual capabilities. His arrogance was going to make the lesson even more devastating. 1 week before the challenge, I received a message from the wilderness cinematographer who'd be documenting the event. He said he'd reviewed Kyle's survival content as preparation, and his professional assessment was that most of it showed signs of staging and support. He said he'd filmed genuine survival situations for military and for legitimate wilderness experts, and Kyle's content didn't match the patterns of authentic survival. He asked if I was certain Kyle could handle 72 hours in actual wilderness conditions. I responded that Kyle would learn his limitations and that I'd ensure he didn't come to serious harm. 3 days before the challenge, Kyle posted a final promotional video. He showed himself packing his minimal gear and talked about how he'd survive easily with just the basics, while I'd probably struggle with military methods that assumed access to military-grade equipment. He said his followers should watch for his detailed content after the challenge, showing how real wilderness experts operated versus how military training approached survival. He was already positioning the narrative to frame himself as superior regardless of what actually happened. I spent the final 2 days before the challenge reviewing medical protocols and emergency procedures. As a SERE instructor, I'd been trained in wilderness medicine and emergency response because survival training involved real risks. I reviewed signs of hypothermia, dehydration, and psychological stress that would indicate Kyle was reaching dangerous levels of distress. I'm mentally prepared for the likelihood that I'd need to care for Kyle when he couldn't care for himself, while simultaneously maintaining the challenge long enough to definitively demonstrate his lack of genuine survival capability. The morning of the challenge arrived with typical early April Montana weather, partly cloudy, temperature at 42 degrees Fahrenheit, forecast showing possible rain, and overnight temperatures dropping to 30 degrees. Challenging conditions, but not extreme, perfect for testing genuine survival skills without creating unnecessary danger. The bush pilot met Kyle and me at a small airstrip where we'd staged our minimal gear. Kyle looked confident and energetic, playing to the small crowd of his social media followers who'd come to see him off. The flight to the drop point took 40 minutes, bringing us deep into Montana wilderness, well beyond casual hiking range. The pilot identified our landing zone, a small clearing near a creek in mixed forest and meadow terrain. The area offered resources for survival, but required knowledge and effort to utilize them. The pilot confirmed he'd return in exactly 72 hours to extract us from the same location. He also confirmed he had the emergency satellite beacon frequency if we needed rescue before the scheduled pickup. Kyle and I stood in the clearing watching the plane depart, its engine sound fading until we were surrounded by wilderness silence. Kyle looked around with what appeared to be confidence, probably mentally comparing the situation to his staged survival videos. I looked around with the trained assessment I developed over 26 years, evaluating shelter locations, water sources, fire material availability, natural navigation markers, and potential hazards. We were in genuine wilderness now, no editing possible, no support coming. The next 72 hours would definitively answer whether Kyle's claimed expertise was real or fabricated. I suggested we start by establishing basic priorities: shelter, water, fire, following the survival rule of threes that SERE training emphasized. Kyle agreed, but immediately proposed we split up to build separate camps, saying he'd demonstrate his shelter construction and survival techniques independently rather than working together. I recognized this as Kyle trying to maintain control of his narrative and avoid direct comparison. I agreed, suggesting we establish camps within shouting distance for safety, but separate enough to demonstrate individual capabilities. Kyle chose a location near the creek that looked scenic but was poor for actual survival, too close to water which would increase humidity and cold, exposed to prevailing wind, and in a slight depression where cold air would settle overnight. I recognized these mistakes immediately, but didn't correct him. He'd learned through experience why SERE training taught specific site selection criteria. I selected a location about 200 yards away on slightly elevated ground with natural wind breaks, positioned to capture morning sun, and near adequate shelter building materials. The first 6 hours revealed the gap between Kyle's social media expertise and practical survival capability. I could hear him working on his shelter, the sounds indicating struggle and frustration rather than competent execution. I built my own shelter using techniques I'd taught thousands of times, a lean-to design with adequate insulation, positioned correctly for drainage and wind protection, constructed efficiently using available materials. The shelter was functional rather than photogenic, built to keep me dry and retain body heat rather than to look impressive on camera. By late afternoon, I completed my shelter and started working on fire preparation, gathering tinder, kindling, and fuel wood, processing materials to ensure they'd burn efficiently even in damp conditions, preparing multiple fire-starting locations in case the first attempt failed. Fire-making in actual survival conditions required preparation and backup plans, not just the single successful attempt that survival videos showed. I could still hear Kyle working on his shelter, the continued noise suggesting he was nowhere near completion. As evening approached and temperature began dropping, I successfully created fire using the waterproof matches from my gear. I'd prepared properly, so the fire caught quickly and burned steadily. I added larger wood to create a sustainable fire that would last through the night with periodic maintenance. I boiled water in my pot to ensure I had safe drinking water. I was comfortable, warm, and secure, exactly what proper survival training created. I couldn't hear any activity from Kyle's camp. No sounds of fire preparation or wood gathering. As darkness fell and temperature continued dropping toward the forecast 30 degrees, I heard Kyle calling out asking if I'd successfully made fire. I responded yes and asked about his status. Long pause. Then Kyle admitted he was having trouble with his shelter and hadn't gotten fire started yet. His voice had lost the confident tone from earlier in the day. 6 hours into the challenge, and the survival expert was already struggling with basics. I called back offering to come help if he needed assistance. Kyle's pride initially made him refuse, saying he'd get his fire going soon. But an hour later, with full darkness and temperature around 35 degrees, Kyle called out again. His voice showed real distress now. He said his shelter wasn't adequate and he couldn't get fire started because his materials were too damp. He asked if he could come to my camp for the night. I agreed, recognizing that Kyle was already at the point where his survival was questionable without assistance. Kyle arrived at my camp looking cold, frustrated, and defeated. His clothing was damp from working near the creek. His hands were scratched and dirty from struggling with shelter construction. His confidence was completely gone, replaced by someone recognizing he was in over his head. We'd been in the wilderness for approximately 8 hours. Kyle had claimed he could survive 30 days with minimal gear. He couldn't even survive one night without help. The soft veteran was about to spend the night warm and comfortable by his fire, while the survival expert learned what real wilderness survival felt like without camera crews and editing. Kyle sat by my fire looking cold, exhausted, and defeated after only 8 hours in wilderness conditions he'd claimed to master. The confident survival expert who'd posted videos mocking military SERE training as soft and outdated was now dependent on the 64-year-old retired instructor he'd dismissed. The temperature was dropping toward 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and Kyle's inability to build adequate shelter or create fire meant he would have faced genuine risk of hypothermia without my assistance. His supposed elite wilderness expertise had collapsed completely when faced with actual survival conditions. I handed Kyle my pot filled with boiled water that had cooled enough to drink safely. He accepted it gratefully and drank deeply, his hands shaking slightly from cold and fatigue. I could see he was dealing with the psychological shock of discovering his survival skills were inadequate. Everything he'd built his identity around, being an elite wilderness expert who could survive anywhere, was being proven false in the most direct way possible. The cognitive dissonance was visible in his expression and body language. I asked Kyle to describe what had gone wrong with his shelter construction and fire preparation. He explained haltingly that the materials near the creek were wetter than he'd expected and harder to work with than in his videos. The shelter he'd started building kept collapsing because the structural design wasn't working with the available materials. His fire preparation had failed because the tinder he'd gathered was too damp and his matches had gotten wet when he'd slipped near the creek. Everything had gone wrong, and he'd spent hours struggling with basic tasks that should have been straightforward for someone with his claimed expertise. I explained that his location selection had created most of his problems. Building near the creek guaranteed damp materials and cold, humid air. The exposed location meant wind was constantly working against his fire-starting efforts. The depression where he'd built would collect cold air overnight, making it the coldest location in the area. These were fundamental site selection errors that SERE training taught students to avoid in the first hours of instruction. Kyle had spent years making survival content without understanding the basics that every SERE graduate knew. I also explained that his shelter design had been chosen for visual appeal rather than functional effectiveness. The elaborate structures that looked impressive in his videos required specific materials, substantial time, and often weren't actually superior to simpler designs for thermal protection. Real survival shelters prioritized speed of construction and heat retention over aesthetic appearance. The lean-to I'd built in 2 hours provided better protection than the complex structure Kyle had spent 6 hours failing to complete. Kyle asked why his fire starting had failed when he'd successfully demonstrated fire making in dozens of videos. I explained that his video demonstrations had always been performed in controlled conditions with processed materials, dry tinder, optimal weather, multiple takes if necessary. Real wilderness fire making required working with damp natural materials, in wind and cold, when you were fatigued and your hands weren't working properly. It required preparation, backup materials, and understanding how to process natural tinder to maximize success chances. Kyle's video technique didn't translate to actual survival conditions. I let Kyle warm up by the fire for an hour while I prepared our sleeping arrangements. My shelter was designed for one person, but could accommodate two if we shared body heat. I explained that we'd need to sleep close together for thermal regulation since Kyle didn't have adequate clothing or shelter. This was standard survival practice that SERE training taught, using shared body heat to prevent hypothermia when resources were limited. Kyle agreed without argument, his earlier arrogance completely gone. As we settled in for the night, I asked Kyle about his 30-day survival series and the other extended wilderness content he'd posted. I asked directly whether he'd actually been alone without support for the durations he'd claimed. Long silence. Then Kyle admitted quietly that the extended survival series had been filmed in short segments over several months with significant support between filming sessions. He'd never actually survived continuously for 30 days. The longest he'd been truly alone in wilderness was approximately 4 days, and even that had involved pre-positioned supply caches. Kyle continued confessing as if the physical failure had broken his psychological barriers to honesty. He said his survival content had started authentic, but had gradually become more staged as he learned what generated views and revenue. He discovered that viewers wanted dramatic survival scenarios and impressive techniques rather than the boring reality of wilderness survival, which involved long periods of discomfort and hunger. He'd started bringing support crews, pre-positioning materials, and editing footage to create the narrative his audience expected rather than documenting actual survival. He said the pressure to maintain his social media image had become overwhelming. His followers expected him to be an elite survival expert who could thrive in any wilderness condition. Admitting he'd staged content or couldn't actually perform at the level he'd claimed would destroy his career and income. So he'd continued creating increasingly elaborate productions while knowing his actual survival skills were minimal. He'd convinced himself that entertainment value mattered more than authenticity and that his followers wouldn't know the difference. I asked Kyle why he'd mocked military SERE training and called veterans like me soft when he knew his own skills were fraudulent. Kyle said that attacking military survival training had been defensive projection. He'd felt threatened by people with legitimate credentials and real survival experience, so he'd attacked them to make his own fraudulent expertise seem superior by comparison. He'd thought that diminishing military training would elevate his social media content by positioning it as more advanced and authentic than what the military taught. The temperature dropped to the forecast 30 degrees overnight. Kyle and I shared the shelter with a carefully maintained fire providing warmth. Kyle slept fitfully, uncomfortable in the wilderness conditions that represented real survival rather than staged entertainment. I slept in intervals as I'd been trained, maintaining the fire and monitoring conditions. This was normal for actual wilderness survival. You didn't sleep peacefully through the night. You stayed partially alert and managed your resources continuously. Morning arrived with temperature around 28 degrees and frost covering everything. Kyle woke looking exhausted and sore, his body not accustomed to sleeping on the ground in cold conditions. I'd maintained the fire overnight, so we had immediate warmth, and I'd collected snow to melt for morning water. Kyle watched me work through the morning routine with what appeared to be genuine respect, replacing his earlier arrogance. He was seeing what actual survival competence looked like: efficient movement, proper prioritization, calm management of discomfort. I explained that we'd now completed approximately 16 hours of the 72-hour challenge. Kyle had failed to build adequate shelter or create fire, had required rescue from hypothermia risk, and had admitted his survival expertise was fraudulent. I said we had two options. We could call for emergency extraction and end the challenge, or we could continue with Kyle learning actual survival skills from someone who'd taught them professionally for 26 years. I emphasized that continuing would be physically demanding and psychologically challenging, but it would teach him what real wilderness survival involved. Kyle chose to continue. He said he wanted to learn genuine skills and wanted to complete the challenge even if it meant being taught by the military veteran he'd mocked. I recognized this as Kyle beginning to process the gap between his fraudulent social media persona and the person he actually was. The physical failure was forcing psychological honesty that had been absent when his survival content was being edited and controlled. We spent day 2 focused on Kyle learning fundamental survival skills properly rather than for camera performance. I taught him correct shelter site selection and construction technique, why location mattered, how to assess materials, which designs provided best thermal efficiency versus construction time. Kyle rebuilt his shelter under my supervision, this time creating a functional lean-to that would actually protect him through the night. The structure wasn't photogenic, but it worked, demonstrating the difference between survival content and survival capability. I taught Kyle proper fire preparation and creation in actual wilderness conditions. We gathered multiple types of tinder, including processing dry material from inside damp wood, prepared kindling in various sizes, and staged backup materials before attempting ignition. Kyle successfully created fire using the bow drill method, but only after 3 hours of work and multiple failures. He experienced the frustration and physical fatigue that real survival firemaking involved, nothing like the edited successful demonstrations in his videos. We addressed water procurement beyond simply boiling creek water. I taught Kyle how to assess water sources for safety, how to identify and avoid contaminated sources, how to create basic filtration when boiling wasn't possible, and how to manage water collection and storage with limited containers. These were practical skills that assumed you couldn't just bring multiple water bottles or have support crew delivering supplies. Kyle was learning that real survival required constant attention to basic needs rather than the dramatic hunting and gathering that made good video content. Food procurement was the hardest lesson. Kyle expected we'd be hunting or fishing to demonstrate survival food acquisition. I explained that real wilderness survival involved being hungry most of the time because finding adequate food was extremely difficult and calorie expenditure often exceeded what you could obtain. We spent hours searching for edible plants and found minimal calories, some cattail roots, a few early spring shoots, nothing substantial. Kyle experienced the reality that survival food procurement was mostly hunger management and calorie conservation rather than the successful hunting his videos portrayed. By the end of day 2, Kyle was physically exhausted, hungry, cold, and genuinely understanding what wilderness survival involved. He'd worked harder in 36 hours than he'd probably worked in all his staged survival content combined. His hands were blistered from shelter construction and firemaking. His body ached from sleeping on the ground and from the constant physical effort survival required. His confidence was completely replaced by respect for how demanding actual survival was without editing and support. That evening we sat by the fire, and Kyle asked me to explain what SERE training actually involved since he'd spent years mocking it without understanding what it taught. I described the full scope of SERE instruction: survival in multiple environments, evasion against trained pursuit, resistance training that simulated captivity, and escape scenarios that required improvisation under pressure. I explained that SERE training assumed worst-case conditions where you were injured, behind enemy lines, with no gear, and being actively hunted. The training was designed for life-or-death situations, not for entertainment content. I also explained that SERE instructors were selected from personnel who demonstrated exceptional survival capabilities and mental toughness under the most demanding conditions. We'd been trained to teach skills that could save lives when everything went wrong, not to create dramatic content for social media. The techniques we taught were proven through decades of real-world application in combat zones, not through video views and follower counts. Kyle was learning that military survival training was far more rigorous and practical than anything he'd imagined. Kyle asked why I'd agreed to this challenge knowing it would expose and humiliate him. I explained that Rachel had shared her concerns about his fraudulent content before she died. I'd promised myself I'd address it, but had delayed because confronting him would be difficult and painful. His video mocking military SERE training and calling veterans soft had forced the issue by making his fraud and disrespect too blatant to ignore. I designed the challenge to definitively prove the difference between real survival capability and social media performance. I also told Kyle that I'd arrange for the remote cameras to document the challenge specifically so there would be objective evidence of what happened. The footage would show his complete failure to perform basic survival tasks, his dependence on my assistance to avoid hypothermia, and the contrast between his claimed expertise and actual capability. I planned to release the footage publicly to ensure his followers understood they'd been deceived and to warn others about trusting social media survival experts without legitimate credentials. Kyle was devastated by the news that his failure was being documented. He asked me not to release the footage, saying it would destroy his career and reputation completely. I responded that his career was already built on fraud and deserved to be destroyed. His reputation should reflect his actual capabilities rather than his edited videos. The footage would serve an educational purpose by showing millions of his followers that social media survival content was often fabricated and that real wilderness survival required legitimate training and experience. As night fell on day 2, Kyle seemed to be processing the full scope of his situation. He'd failed the survival challenge completely. He'd admitted his content was fraudulent. His failure was documented on camera. His career as a survival expert was about to be publicly destroyed. The confident influencer who'd called me a soft veteran was now a broken person recognizing that everything he'd built was based on lies that were about to be exposed to millions of people. We had one more full day in the wilderness before extraction. Kyle would spend that time learning just how much further his inadequacies extended when real survival was required. Day 3 began with Kyle looking physically and emotionally exhausted from 48 hours of actual wilderness survival without the support and editing that had enabled his fraudulent content. The temperature overnight had dropped to 26 degrees, colder than the previous night, and Kyle had spent restless hours in his rebuilt shelter managing the fire and dealing with discomfort that no amount of editing could hide. He emerged in the morning looking like someone who'd been genuinely surviving rather than performing for cameras. Dirty, tired, hungry, and defeated. I maintained the morning routine efficiently while Kyle struggled with basic tasks. I'd spent 26 years training for exactly these conditions, and my body responded automatically to the requirements: fire management, water procurement, shelter maintenance, constant assessment of weather and conditions. Kyle watched me work with what appeared to be genuine understanding finally developing about the gap between his social media expertise and real wilderness capability. He was seeing decades of practical experience applied efficiently, while his own minimal skills barely kept him functional. We spent the morning addressing the harsh reality of extended wilderness survival that Kyle's videos had never shown. The cumulative fatigue, the constant cold despite fire, the gnawing hunger from inadequate food, the psychological stress of discomfort that never stopped. Kyle was experiencing what soldiers in SERE training experienced during the extended survival phases, the grinding challenge that tested mental toughness more than physical capability. This was what real survival involved beyond the first successful fire or completed shelter that made good video content. I taught Kyle about injury prevention and management in survival situations, explaining that in actual wilderness emergencies the greatest danger was often not dramatic events, but accumulated small problems: blisters that became infected, dehydration that impaired judgment, hypothermia that developed gradually through inadequate shelter. I showed him how SERE training emphasized constant self-monitoring and preventive care, because in real survival, you couldn't call for medical support or edit out consequences of mistakes. Kyle asked about the psychological aspects of survival, admitting he was struggling mentally with the constant discomfort and the knowledge that his failure was being documented. I explained that SERE training included extensive instruction on survival psychology, managing fear, maintaining hope, resisting despair during extended hardship. I taught mental techniques for coping with discomfort and uncertainty, techniques that soldiers used during actual captivity and evasion situations. Kyle was learning that survival expertise included mental resilience that his comfortable content creation had never required. By midday, Kyle was dealing with what SERE instructors called the breaking point, the moment when accumulated stress, discomfort, hunger, and fatigue overwhelmed psychological defenses and forced genuine self-assessment. He sat by the fire looking at his blistered hands and said quietly that he'd built his entire adult identity on being a survival expert, had convinced hundreds of thousands of people to trust his advice and purchase his courses, and now understood he'd been selling fraud that could have gotten people killed if they'd relied on his techniques in actual emergencies. Kyle said he was struggling to reconcile the person he'd presented on social media with the person he actually was, someone with minimal real skills who'd prioritized revenue and ego over honesty. He said watching me perform survival tasks efficiently while he could barely manage basic needs had forced him to confront how fraudulent his claimed expertise had been. He asked how he could possibly make amends for years of deception and for mocking military veterans whose actual capabilities exceeded anything he'd pretended to possess. I told Kyle that acknowledging the fraud was the first step, but that real accountability required public admission and accepting consequences. The documented footage from this challenge would destroy his survival influencer career when released, but that destruction was deserved and necessary. People who trusted his advice and purchased his courses based on his fraudulent credentials deserved to know they'd been deceived. His followers who'd been inspired by his supposed expertise deserved to understand that social media survival content was often fabricated entertainment rather than legitimate instruction. I also told Kyle that he'd mocked military SERE training and called veterans soft while knowing his own skills were fraudulent, and that disrespect required public apology to the military community. He'd attacked the legitimacy of survival training that had saved lives in actual combat situations while promoting content that could endanger people who relied on it. That wasn't just fraud, it was potentially dangerous deception that undermined trust in legitimate survival instruction. As afternoon approached, and we prepared for our final night before extraction, Kyle asked what would happen after we left the wilderness. I explained that I planned to release the full documented footage with educational commentary explaining where Kyle's techniques had failed and why SERE training emphasized different approaches. The footage would include his admission that his content had been staged and his expertise was fraudulent. It would serve as a comprehensive case study in the difference between social media performance and real wilderness survival capability. Kyle asked if there was any way to avoid public exposure of his failure, perhaps privately ending his survival content career without the documented humiliation. I told him that private resolution would leave his existing content online deceiving people and would allow him to potentially restart fraudulent activity later. Public exposure was necessary for accountability and for education. His 3.5 million followers deserve to see objective evidence that his claimed expertise was false. Other survival influencers deserve to see consequences for fraudulent content that might discourage similar deception. The final night in the wilderness was the coldest yet, with temperatures dropping to 24 degrees. Kyle managed his shelter and fire independently this time, applying the skills I'd taught him over the past 3 days. He was barely competent but functional, representing what a few days of actual instruction could achieve versus years of stage content creation. He experienced a full night of wilderness survival, where he was responsible for keeping himself alive without my direct assistance, learning what it felt like to be truly alone with only basic skills between himself and hypothermia. Morning of day 4 arrived with clear skies and warming temperatures. We had 6 hours before the scheduled extraction at the 72-hour mark. Kyle had survived the challenge, but only because I provided instruction, assistance, and safety backup when his skills proved inadequate. Without my presence, he would have called for emergency rescue within the first night. His supposed elite wilderness expertise had been completely exposed as fraudulent when tested under actual survival conditions. We spent the final hours preparing for extraction and discussing what Kyle would do after returning to civilization. He said he'd delete all his survival content and issue a public statement admitting it had been staged and his expertise had been fraudulent. He said he'd offer full refunds to everyone who'd purchased his ultimate survival course. He said he'd publicly apologized to the military community for mocking SERE training and disrespecting veterans. He understood his career as a survival influencer was finished, but hoped to begin rebuilding with honesty. The bush pilot arrived precisely on schedule, landing in the same clearing where he dropped us 72 hours earlier. Kyle and I gathered our minimal gear and boarded for the flight back to civilization. Kyle looked nothing like the confident survival expert who'd flown in 3 days earlier. He looked like someone who'd been genuinely surviving and had been broken by the experience. I looked essentially the same as when we'd arrived, demonstrating that real survival capability meant managing wilderness conditions without being destroyed by them. The wilderness cinematographer met us at the airstrip with his remote camera footage, approximately 18 hours of time-stamped, unedited documentation showing the entire challenge. The footage clearly showed Kyle's complete failure at basic survival tasks, his dependence on my assistance, and the stark contrast between his claimed expertise and actual capability. It also captured audio of his admissions that his content had been staged and his credentials were fraudulent. The footage was comprehensive objective evidence that would definitively prove Kyle's survival expertise was fake. Within 48 hours of returning from the wilderness, Kyle posted a video titled, "I lied about everything. My survival content was fake." The video showed Kyle looking exhausted and defeated, admitting that his multi-day survival content had been staged with crew support. His techniques had been performed in controlled conditions that didn't represent actual wilderness survival, and his claimed expertise was fraudulent. He admitted that when challenged to prove his skills in real 72-hour wilderness survival, he'd failed completely and had required assistance from the military SERE instructor he'd mocked to avoid hypothermia and potential death. Kyle's confession video included footage from the challenge showing his failed shelter construction, his inability to create fire, and his request for help after only 8 hours. It showed him learning basic survival skills from me after admitting he didn't actually know how to survive without support. It showed the visible gap between his social media confidence and his actual wilderness competence. The video was a comprehensive admission of fraud that left no room for his followers to claim misunderstanding or misrepresentation. The response was immediate and explosive. Kyle's video was viewed over 60 million times in the first week as word spread across social media that a major survival influencer had admitted complete fraud. His follower count collapsed from 3.5 million to less than 200,000 as people unfollowed or as platforms suspended accounts for violating terms of service regarding deceptive content. Every piece of survival content he'd posted was now being examined and mocked as obvious fraud that viewers had been fooled into believing was authentic. The survival content creator community scrambled to distance themselves from Kyle and to prove their own content was authentic. Several survival influencers posted videos showing unedited multi-day footage or submitting to third-party verification of their skills. Others admitted they'd known Kyle's content was staged but had stayed silent because calling out fraud was bad for the community. The revelation triggered broader scrutiny of survival content across social media, with viewers demanding proof that other survival experts had legitimate credentials and actual wilderness experience. Outdoor gear companies that had sponsored Kyle's content immediately terminated relationships and demanded return of free equipment and sponsorship fees. Several issued statements saying they'd been deceived by Kyle's fraudulent claims of expertise and that they required legitimate credentials from future sponsored creators. Adventure travel companies and wilderness guide services that had featured Kyle disavowed his content and removed any association with him from their marketing materials. More seriously, several state attorney general offices and the Federal Trade Commission opened investigations into Kyle's business practices. He'd sold survival courses for nearly $2,500 each to thousands of people while misrepresenting his qualifications and the authenticity of his content. He'd claimed techniques and results that were only achievable with professional crew support, while implying students could replicate them with basic training. Multiple class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of people who'd purchased courses under false pretenses. 3 months after the Wilderness Challenge, Kyle posted a final update. He'd processed full refunds for everyone who'd purchased his Ultimate Survival course, totaling approximately $4.2 million and bankrupting his content business. He'd settled with the FDC and state investigators by agreeing to permanent injunctions preventing him from selling survival courses or advertising survival expertise. He'd left social media entirely and was working in a non-outdoor field, trying to rebuild his life based on honesty rather than the fraud that had defined his previous career. Kyle's final video included a specific apology to me and to the military veteran community. He acknowledged that military SERE training represented legitimate survival expertise developed through decades of real-world application in life-or-death situations, and that his attacks on that training had been ignorant disrespect born from his own insecurity about having no real credentials. He thanked me for exposing his fraud before it could endanger more people and for teaching him genuine survival basics during the challenge, even after he'd spent years mocking me. I released my own comprehensive video using the documented footage from the challenge, titled Real Wilderness Survival versus Social Media Fraud, a SERE instructor's perspective. The video showed side-by-side comparisons of Kyle's failed attempts at basic survival tasks versus proper SERE technique and explained why his methods didn't work. It provided educational commentary on shelter construction, fire creation, water procurement, and psychological management in actual survival conditions. It served as a detailed lesson in the difference between entertainment content and practical survival instruction. My video was viewed over 40 million times and became a reference used by outdoor educators, military training programs, and survival schools. Multiple SERE instructors and survival experts contacted me to say the video effectively demonstrated why legitimate credentials and real training mattered versus social media popularity. Several wilderness guide programs adopted it as required viewing for students to illustrate the dangers of learning survival skills from unverified online content. I also established a foundation using proceeds from speaking engagements that followed the viral videos. The foundation provided free survival education for veterans and their families, teaching legitimate wilderness skills and outdoor safety. It also created educational content debunking fraudulent survival advice and teaching people how to evaluate survival information sources for credibility. The Foundation's work reached hundreds of thousands of people looking for honest survival instruction in a social media landscape filled with entertainment masquerading as expertise. 2 years after the Wilderness Challenge, I received a letter from Kyle. He'd completed community service requirements from his legal settlements and was working as a warehouse manager, far removed from survival content creation. He wrote that the past 2 years had been the most difficult of his life as he dealt with the complete destruction of his career, public humiliation, and financial ruin from refunds and legal settlements. But he said the forced accountability had been necessary because his fraud had been real and dangerous. Kyle wrote that the 72 hours in Montana wilderness had been the most important experience of his life because it had forced him to confront the gap between his social media persona and his actual capabilities. He said watching me efficiently perform survival tasks while he failed at basics had taught him that real expertise came from decades of training and experience, not from editing and staging. He said he'd spent years attacking military veterans whose capabilities exceeded anything he could do, and understanding that truth had been painful but necessary. I wrote back acknowledging his apparent growth and understanding. I told him that acknowledging fraud and accepting consequences were signs of character development that had been missing when he was creating staged content for revenue and ego. I said that if he'd learned that real capability mattered more than social media popularity and that honesty was more valuable than fraudulent success, the painful experience would ultimately prove beneficial. I also told him that SERE training emphasized that survival included rebuilding after failure, and I hoped he'd apply that principle to rebuilding his life with integrity. I'm Marcus Reeves, 66 years old now. I'm a retired Army Ranger and SERE instructor who spent 26 years teaching soldiers how to survive in conditions that most people couldn't imagine. I'm a father who lost his daughter but honored her memory by exposing the fraud she'd suspected and protecting thousands of people from trusting dangerous advice disguised as expertise. Kyle Patterson called me a soft veteran and built a career on stage survival content while mocking military SERE training as outdated. He claimed his years of wilderness experience made him an elite expert, while actual military survival training was basic preparation for controlled scenarios. He convinced 3.5 million followers that his techniques represented cutting-edge survival knowledge that exceeded what the military taught. He learned that Army Ranger and SERE training creates survival capabilities that work in actual wilderness conditions without editing or support. That 26 years of teaching soldiers to survive behind enemy lines produces expertise that social media content creation can never replicate. That real survival involves cumulative discomfort, hunger, cold, and psychological stress that staged entertainment never shows. To anyone whose military survival training has been dismissed by social media survival experts, or whose wilderness expertise has been mocked by influencers who've never faced actual survival conditions, remember this: legitimate survival capability is proven through performance in real conditions, not through edited videos and follower counts. SERE training exists because it works in actual life or death situations. The techniques we taught saved lives in combat zones around the world. Kyle's career collapsed because he'd built it entirely on staged content and fraudulent claims. When tested in actual wilderness survival for 72 hours, he failed completely within 8 hours and required rescue from the military veteran he'd mocked. The soft veteran survived comfortably using decades of real training, while the survival expert nearly died from hypothermia after less than one night. This is Master Sergeant Rep Marcus Reeves, United States Army Rangers and SERE, signing off. To my fellow veterans and SERE graduates, your training matters. The survival skills you learned are legitimate and practical. Don't let social media culture make you doubt capabilities that were proven in actual combat and survival situations. Maintain your skills, take pride in your training, and know that real survival expertise exceeds anything social media influencers can fake. The mission continues. The skills endure. And the truth always survives.